All right, last let's look at how skeletal muscle has its energy provided. So as with most cases, ATP provides the energy for muscle contraction. Now if we took all the ATP which was present in our skeletal muscles in that form and then contracted the skeletal muscle, we would have enough energy to last for only a few seconds. Now the next step that's going to provide ATP is going to be the replenishment of ATP by the transfer of energy from a substance called creatine phosphate, which is located in skeletal muscle. So creatine phosphate donates a phosphate group to the ADP that was created when ATP was hydrolyzed, and so it readily replenishes the ATP. So if we take the ATP that's present in cells, which lasts for a few seconds, and then take the ATP that's replenished by the creatine phosphate, we would have enough energy for that skeletal muscle to contract for about 10 seconds. So all this means that we have to have yet another step which is going to provide the ATP to allow us to continue with our muscle contractions. So glycolysis will be a step that some muscle fibers will use. And glycolysis is a way of rapidly producing ATP, but it's not a particularly efficient way to produce ATP. But it produces enough ATP that it can create ATP to last for several minutes. Oxidative phosphorylation, which uses oxygen, provides ATP theoretically for as long as nutritional stores are present. So we're going to classify skeletal muscle based on two things. One will be the speed of contraction. Now the speed of contraction is going to be related to the ATPase, which is present on the myosin head. Recall that one of the binding sites on the myosin head was actually an enzyme, and this is an enzyme that hydrolyzes ATP. Some myosin molecules have a fast ATPase, and these then are going to be our fast fibers. Other myosin molecules have a slow myosin ATPase activity, relatively speaking, and those are referred to as slow fibers. So the first classification, muscle fibers, will call them as fast or slow. The second means of defining specific muscle fiber types is based on their primary means of producing ATP. So again, recall that all cells will have ATP present. All muscle cells can use creatine phosphate. But it's this next step which then differentiates between what type of fibers we're talking about. So some fibers are going to have the machinery which is going to make them most efficient at performing glycolysis. Other muscle fibers are going to have the machinery present which is going to make them most efficient at performing oxidative phosphorylation. So for those who use glycolysis, we're going to refer to those as glycolytic fibers. These tend to be larger fibers, and because they don't use oxygen as much, they don't have as rich of a vascular supply. And although they can generate lots of ATP, they do this only for a relatively brief period of time, so we say that these fibers are more likely to fatigue, or they have a low resistance to fatigue. Fibers that primarily use oxidative phosphorylation, on the other hand, these we refer to as oxidative fibers. Oxidative fibers, compared to the glycolytic fibers, tend to be smaller, which means they tend to be weaker. They have a very good vascular supply because this is providing the oxygen necessary for oxidative phosphorylation. They also contain abundant stores of what we call myoglobin, and myoglobin is a protein which binds to oxygen and has a higher affinity for oxygen than does hemoglobin. So this is a mechanism that oxidative fibers can utilize to make sure they get the oxygen that they need. Because these can provide ATP for long periods of time, these we say have a high resistance to fatigue. So here's a slide which shows just general characteristics of the glycolytic fibers and the oxidative fibers. So notice the oxidative fibers, these white channels represent capillaries, so they have a much richer blood vessel supply. Notice the fibers are smaller in cross-sectional area, As we indicated, the oxidative fibers tend to be smaller in size. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine the type of myosin that muscle fibers have, and that will determine fast or slow, and we combine that with the metabolic characteristics by which muscle fibers produce their ATP. And this gives us 3 different fiber types: slow oxidative fibers, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic. So here's a picture which demonstrates 3 different motor units. The first motor unit we can see, and this picture is drawn to represent some scale, so we can look at the size of these muscle fibers here in the purple motor unit, or X motor unit, and notice that these are smaller fibers. These are our slow oxidative fibers. On the other end of the spectrum, we have our big thick fibers. These are going to be our fast glycolytic fibers. Now these fibers in the middle are our fast oxidative fibers, and they just are going to fall in the median there. So my suggestion is to focus on learning the characteristics of the slow oxidative, learning the characteristics of the fast glycolytic, and realize that the fast oxidative just falls somewhere in between. Now the interesting thing is that the size of the neuron and the diameter of the axon that goes to these fibers is proportional to the size of the muscle fibers themselves. So with our slow oxidative fibers, these neurons are thinner than the neuron that goes to the fast glycolytic fibers, which is a much thicker neuron. And this is then going to impact the order in which these motor units are recruited. So what we see on the bottom here, we're showing that initially we are going to be activating the purple motor unit, and it's going to be the first which is going to generate tension. But notice it doesn't generate a great deal of tension, but it can at least maintain that tension for a long period of time. The last motor unit we're going to be recruiting is going to be our fast glycolytic fiber. Notice that it generates a lot of tension, but what we'll see is that tension then can only be maintained for a short period of time before it starts to fatigue out. But every time we are activating a muscle and recruiting motor units, they always are going to be recruited in this order. The slow oxidative fibers first, the fast glycolytic last. And again, the fast oxidative falls somewhere in between. This is referred to as the size principle of recruitment.